Hello there. Hi. Hey guys. It's actually really difficult to figure out an intro to a video, so I'll just stick with hey guys. So actually I'm a German speaking YouTuber. Normally I talk a lot about studying and actual German, so if you speak German, check out my main channel. This is basically my channel for shits and giggles. So we're here and we're going to talk about my favorite books today. Actually looking through my bookshelf and thinking about which books I really enjoyed or which books actually taught me some kind of lesson. I did realize I think I live in a bit of a book bubble. I have the feeling that I get a lot of my recommendations from the New York Times or Oprah basically, and some Bookstagram accounts. I don't think my book choices are very diverse. I think most of you have probably heard about these books. So if you have any suggestions on how to get out of a book bubble and try to find different authors, different stories, then actually let me know in the comments. I would really appreciate that. So we're gonna start with actually Die Bücherdieben by Markus Zusak. I have the German version, but this is actually originally written in English, which I didn't know because Markus Zusak actually sounds very German, but it is an Australian author. So the original title is The Book Thief, and I absolutely love this book. This would be a really good time to reread because I don't remember the plot. I really don't remember what happens. I read this book on a plane ride to the States when I was, I think, 17, and it's actually a big compliment to a book. But it is in the Second World War. It plays around then, and it's about, I think, a girl that steals books but has a moral belief that it's okay. But I can't really remember it, like I said. But it's a really good book. I remember being super impressed by it, and I read it really fast, so I read it in 7 hours, which is pretty impressive. The next book is actually a more recent book. It is Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by, and I'm going to pronounce this name wrong, Renée Eddo-Lodge, I don't know. It is a book that is based by UK, so the author, and I really appreciate this, talks about Black history and white history, European history, and talks a lot about European history that isn't well known. Because a lot of European countries aren't very in sync with their taking part in slavery. They just kind of let the Americans deal with that thing. Slavery was a big topic in Europe as well, so there was a lot of slave trading. There were a lot of things that happened. They actually did have colonies, and there is a Black population in Europe that is also not being recognized for that history. So this was really interesting to read, basically a UK history of Black people, or European history of how Black people came to Europe basically, and it was very enlightening, and I thought it was a really, really good read. But what I really enjoyed about it was how to have these conversations. So the book isn't exactly a nice read, especially if you are white and you've never been confronted with some of these issues, or you've never actually thought about some of these things. So this book had a really nice way of talking about certain privileges that we do have and being able to live with that privilege, because it's not like I can give away white privilege. It's not like I can share that with anyone. That's just a privilege I have. But there is a way to be responsible with that privilege, to be aware of how you're having it, and to be able to have conversations about that white privilege and about racism and racial injustice and systems like that. I think it's also really good for us to not normalize the subject, but make it more common so people don't feel as, so bad about it or as uncomfortable when you're actually talking to someone, because it's really important that we do have these conversations about race. It especially taught me a lot about listening, which I think is really important. So this is I think this should be basic reading for white people. This should just be the basic knowledge on how to have conversations about racism, because they're difficult. They are absolutely difficult, and I find them super difficult, but they're also really important, and we need to talk about stuff like that. So sticking to the topic of racism, or at least social injustice, I really like the author Colson Whitehead. He's probably well known for his first book, The Underground Railroad, which I also really, really enjoyed. I thought it was actually interesting to talk to my German friends about that book, because a lot of my German friends are really good in English, so they read a lot of stuff in original language, but actually The Underground Railroad was really difficult to read for them because of the language used in the book, because the language used by the protagonist and her describing what's happening to her is actually a very authentic way of speaking, or at least in that time or in that context, it was a very authentic way of speaking. And I think that really added to the story and really added to the character and gave it a lot of depth. But I have to say, I think I enjoyed The Nickel Boys just a tad more. I thought The Underground Railroad was a great book, especially because I think you can teach a lot more things in fiction. I think it's really nice to open up certain parts of history through fiction and help people actually live through what other people lived through, or at least give them a glimpse of it. And I think that's a better way to learn than necessarily stating facts in a classroom. But what I really liked about the Nickel Boys is that it talked, or not necessarily directly touched, the subject of generations and passing on trauma from one generation to the next, but it kind of insinuated it at the end. Number one, I couldn't predict the end. I did not see the end coming the way it did, and I really appreciate that because I'm very good at guessing plot lines, and I kind of don't like it unless the book is really well written, because then I can still enjoy the book. But if I can guess the end, if I can guess the plots, I really don't enjoy them as much. But this one, I did not guess the end, and it was just nice that the protagonist just reflected on how his youth affected his later life and how he passes this on, this trauma that he had, onto people around him, how it affected his relationships and probably even his children. Because I think something we really forget is that if you have a history in your family of, I don't know, either slavery or a history of all kinds of genocide, if you have indigenous background or something, then your family, so someone in your family has experienced this trauma and they pass it on to the next generation. Because even if you're freed from the bad situation you were in, you still have trauma. You're still psychologically really, really affected, and it's really difficult to get out of that mindset, and you can't. You can never really escape that past. And so in a certain way, you're always going to pass it on to the next generation. And I think generation by generation, it might change, and it might not be as horrible or might not be as affected. Your kids might not be as affected as you were, but it's still something that can generally be passed on. And I think that's something we really need to talk about, because sometimes you can't make good choices if you weren't raised correctly, or if you weren't raised in a certain environment or didn't get a certain education. And that is so heavily dependent on the way your parents are, the way they raised you, the way they were raised by their parents or your grandparents. And I think that's a theme I really like to see in books, to see explored, see how past things can actually live on for generations. So now on to something a little lighter. This is actually a German book. This is by Walter Mörs, Die Stadt der träumenden Bücher. I have no idea if this book was actually translated into English. Like I said, I tried to read things in their original language. But if you're actually learning German, so Walter Mörs is a children's author, book author, children's youth author, I don't know. This is a children's book, okay? But it's still so well written. It's like this big adventure story about this underground library where you can get lost in, and you can be lost in for decades. And it's a really great story. I can keep rereading this every 5 years because it has all kinds of different nooks and crannies and different things, and it's so much fun to read. And if you're learning German, this is actually a really good author because he uses a lot of different words. He uses a lot of adjectives. So I really enjoy these books. Every once in a while when I need a really light read and I just want an adventure story, I'll read these. The next book, also some light entertainment. I'm not going to show you the physical books because there are way too many, but Harry Potter, of course, is on the very top of my list. Now, I know this might be a childhood obsession, and a lot of people think it's ridiculous to hold on to a book for so long. What I find so fascinating about Harry Potter is that every time you reread the books, and I constantly reread them because I always am listening to the books. I'm always listening to the audiobook before I fall asleep every single day, or when I need some light entertainment, or when I'm just feeling like it, I will always listen to Harry Potter. And the more you reread these books, the deeper you get into the plot, and you have different characters, and you start understanding all these things, and you're so deep into the emotions of these people, what they're feeling, and so deep into the plot line. And there's so much to interpret. So they're not just a good story. It actually is a story with so much depth and like a lot of literary interpretation that every single time and in every stage of your life, you can relate to these books in a different way. And I just find that absolutely fascinating. And I also really enjoyed reading a lot of background information on Pottermore, and they have a few really good ebooks on Pottermore that I really enjoyed. And I think it was like the history of Hogwarts and the history of some characters, and I really enjoyed reading more about those, like even the development of Azkaban, the prison, and how that came to be, how the Dementors came to be, and why they actually ended up working for the Ministry of Magic because they're like these awful things. So I'm going to talk about Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale, and I love this book. I love this book way before it was hyped, because the recent years it's been hyped. The new TV series has come out, and I think Margaret Atwood used that momentum to bring a second book, The Testaments, which is not on my favorite lists, but is the second book to this. And I love this book for so many reasons. She really shows a lot of issues that we have with women and women's bodies. And what I really liked about this book is that it didn't, I mean, yes, you have systemic rape and you have all of this violation of the body, of like the actual women's bodies. But what I really appreciated was how well she depicted the violation of mind. So like the psychological violation of people, and how you could indoctrinate people with all these new certain things, and how they really get into your head and try to implant different ideology into you. I think it's really important to understand that things like that can happen to us, that we in our social context are always indoctrinated with a certain type of thinking and way of thinking. And I guess I'm really sensitive to this because I did grow up biculturally, so I am an American, but I grew up in Germany, and it will forever be fascinating to me how they can't understand each other on basic levels. Because, and I get this, the older I get, the more I understand the fact that Germans just have a certain way of thinking, especially with the more social system here. We have more of a blanket. We have actual health insurance for everyone, and university is free, and it's the most amazing thing. But it also has its faults, of course. It's important to say it also has its faults. And Germans will never ever understand why there are so many Americans who believe that that is just fundamentally wrong. And I can understand that they can't understand it, and I can morally not understand it, but in my head I can, because it's just a completely different way of thinking and seeing things. It's a completely different way of seeing life. If you say, I just don't want the government to interfere with my stuff. And it's also a very valid way of thinking. It might not be the best for our modern society, but that's a whole different discussion. It always fascinates me that the one can almost never understand the other unless they've lived in that country for a certain amount of time. And when I try to explain it to them, it's always just like, well, it's just a completely different way of thinking. You just have to turn off everything you think is right and then just try to think of the other perspective. And I guess that's why I always appreciate books that are in like a monologue and inside another person's head, because that is one of the few experiences where you can really, really understand the way another person is thinking and what they're thinking and how they get from point A to point B. So I always really appreciate books like this, and this is why this was probably one of the books I really, really enjoyed the most. And because I'm a bit of a freak and I like to suffer when I'm reading, I'm also a very big fan of dystopias, and probably the dystopia of dystopia is George Orwell's 1984, which is probably the dystopia of dystopia. This was the first dystopian novel that I ever read, and I just loved it. I don't know, I like reading really sad and difficult things. Speaking of books with suffering, I have some John Steinbeck here. I have The Grapes of Wrath, but I also have another book of his here. The Pearl, probably one of his lesser known books. I think he's also very well known for Of Mice and Men, which is also, of course, a very tragic story, but that was also one of the books where you could really guess the plot lines. Really difficult story, really morally interesting to have a discussion about that. But I really appreciated The Grapes of Wrath. This was a book that my dad recommended to me, and I think he really relates to the story for one reason or another, and that's why I really enjoyed reading it, just because sometimes it's just really nice to read the books that your parents love, just to understand what they go through or what they can relate to, and you can relate to their character a little more. And I think I did understand a few things about my dad reading this book. And I think this type of writing is something that we don't really see anymore in modern day books. I think John Steinbeck is still of the generation where you can have a 10-page monologue on what the dust is like, and that's a metaphor for the drying economy. I really like that type of depth in a book. But of course, it also takes a bit more energy to read something like this in comparison to, of course, a fast-paced modern novel. So it's not everyone's piece of cake, and I completely understand that. So keeping in line with like older authors, I'm going to talk quickly about Henry James and Washington Square. This novel was a surprising like. For some reason, I liked it. I don't really know why. I basically just picked it up because it was cheap and it was wonderfully bound, and that's why I read it. But I actually really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed his style. I have the feeling that Henry James, because I looked it up, he's an American author, and I feel like he tried to like mimic the classic English literature of the time, and so it's pretty funny. But it's sometimes nice to make fun of things or people indirectly, and I guess that's what he does in this story, which is why I really enjoyed it. It's just amazing to me how completely differently women were treated in a different time. So basically it's about this girl or young woman or whatever who falls in love with a guy who basically just wants to marry her for her money, and her dad already kind of understands that, but she doesn't. And her aunt thinks that this guy that's trying to impress her is the greatest guy on earth, and everyone has his or her own agenda with her. She just kind of wants to just marry the guy, but the dad says no, and then eventually it all doesn't happen. But it's more, I don't know, if you would have properly educated your kid, then she would have never gotten into that situation, and yet they just keep babying her, and I just think that's such an ironic cycle. So this next book is kind of, you can't really call it a favorite book, but I really enjoy this for some reason. I found it in a secondhand bookshop in London, and it is called The Domestic Manners of the Americans, and it's by a guy named Francis Trollope. So basically it's this guy going to the States, and this is like his diary or what he has seen of the United States or what he thinks of these people. And it's really interesting because it's like an outsider's perspective at the time of American people, and he sees them as quite barbarian because I guess the country was a lot more wild than the UK was. I mean, UK country is definitely not like the Wild West, and definitely not in the time when this was written. So this first published in 1832, so it was still a very different time. He also does touch on slavery and everything and how barbaric the things are, but of course if you look at UK history at the time, probably not the best person to be able to say this is barbaric or not. But what I just find interesting is the snide comments he makes about Americans, and it's just was something I really enjoy. And now arrived the 4th of July, that greatest of all American festivals. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Declaration of their Independence was signed at the State House in Philadelphia. To me, the dreary coldness and want of enthusiasm in American manners is one of their greatest defects, and I therefore hailed the demonstrations of general feeling which this day elicits with real pleasure. On the 4th of July, the hearts of the people seem to awaken from a 364 days' sleep. They appear high-spirited, gay, animated, social, generous, or at least liberal in expense. And would they but refrain from spitting on that hallowed day, I should say that on the 4th of July at least they appeared to be an amiable people. It's just funny. On to a few more. We are almost through with the stack. I'm so sorry, this video is already so long. Here's another German book, Jenny Appenbeck, Gehen ging gegangen. Actually, this was translated, I know this was translated into English, and Jenny Appenbeck writes pretty cool books. She very often writes books that touch on important historical times of German history. So she also has this book about a house that has lived through different time periods. So a house that was built pre-Second World War, then what happens in the Second World War right after Cold War, and so on. And it's actually really interesting because you're seeing these different time periods not from the perspective of people, but from the perspective of the house and the people rotating through. And this was also a really interesting book. It's about basically the refugee crisis that we had in 2015, 2016 here in Europe. And it's written from the perspective of this old professor. He is now retired. He and his wife just passed away. His girlfriend is kind of boring. And he keeps hearing on the news, oh, these refugees. And he just wants to know who these refugees are. So what he basically does is he just like walks up to one of their housing units and is like, I'd like to talk to the refugees. And he develops these relationships with these people and sees all of the irony and everything. And I just love the way he does that because it's written in such a very dry, typical German style. But at the same time, it's making fun of exactly that because most of the German things are super bureaucratic. And of course, a refugee that can't speak German, that just is super traumatized by war and all of these things, is not going to be able to grasp the complete bureaucratic system of Germany. There's just no way. And he just puts it into wonderful words and explains these things so dryly, but still very clearly. A very good read, a very quick read, and I think also a good read for people who don't understand why the whole refugee thing is an issue. And another book here by an author called Elif Shafak. So she is of Turkish heritage. I think she also went to college in England, I think to Oxford and other places. And she writes books about people who live in between maybe an English culture and the Turkish culture. So very often the immigrants from Turkey or the second generation immigrants from Turkey, and talks about the cultural differences that they have. And I read another book of hers that I didn't enjoy as much, but this one I actually did really enjoy because she took the whole family history into account. And like I said, I really like it when books take into account like how things are passed on in a family. And it's about an honor killing. So many moons ago, it was more honorable if like a woman had dishonored the family by having an extramarital affair. It could be your honor could be saved by killing said person. And very often this happened to women, and it's an issue. And this talks about an honor killing in a family. So a son kills his mom. It talks about how that whole situation came to be, how the father grew up, the mom, how they met each other, what their parents were like, and like really led up to that moment. And I thought it was super interesting. And there is a plot twist in there that I did not expect, but I kind of didn't see what it did for the story, but it was really interesting to see all of the thought that goes into something like that. So I really enjoyed this. I have 2 more books left. Actually 3. Crap. But one of them is, in German it's called Die Frau des Zeitreisenden, and I think in English it's The Wife of the Time Traveler, something like that, but it was definitely translated. And it's just a really nice story. It's about this woman who in her life, she has this dude who keeps showing up in the weirdest situations, and eventually she figures out that it's her husband, it's the guy she's meant to marry, and he is a time traveler, so he just keeps popping in and out of time, and then in and out of bad and good situations. And it's really tragic, but it's just a really, really nice story. It's well written. It's really cool. I really enjoyed this. Another story that I really, really enjoyed was Cloud Atlas, and I don't have the physical book anymore because I lent it to a friend and she never gave it back. Cloud Atlas was another story that I really liked. This might also be a good book to reread because I can't really remember the plot. I know that it was super confusing and super difficult because the timeline was like all scrambled up, but I loved it because for half of the book I was like, what is happening? What's going on here? And then all of a sudden it all made sense, and it was like, wow. And it made so many different predictions of like our future and how our future and our past are intertwined, and how some events may not seem as detrimental at first, but then how they act out in the long run. And especially if you're looking at climate change, if you're looking at these huge problems that we have, it's really interesting to see every once in a while, like this newspaper clipping from 1910 will pop up where like people are like, oh, maybe burning coal isn't such a good idea. It's not that good for the environment, but that's 2020 population people's problems. They'll figure it out. Cloud Atlas is kind of like that too, and that's why I really liked it. And another book that has to make this list is actually the one only non-fiction book. Actually, no, I have one other non-fiction book, but it is The Homo Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, I think is his name. I listened to this book, so I also do not have a physical copy, but it's a really cool history of mankind, and it doesn't necessarily go through the biological history. It touches on that, but it looks at the cultural revolutions and like the cultural stages of humanity, and then kind of explains where we got, why we have some of the reflexes we do, brings up some controversies of history and some very controversial parts of mankind. There are a lot of things that my boyfriend and I talk about a lot. For example, the luxury trap and like all kinds of concepts, and he touches on a lot of those things and a lot of big social issues, but he does it so very scientifically that it's just really enjoyable to listen to. I thought it was a great audiobook. I will be listening to his second book also via audiobook, but I think I will eventually buy a physical hard copy just because I really enjoyed them. So that's my very long list of books that I really, really enjoyed. These are basically my best ofs. I'm sure I forgot a lot of books that I really enjoyed. And as you've noticed, some books I can't even remember the plot, but I know that they're good. I remember really, really liking them. But let me know in the comments what your favorite books are, what you've enjoyed, what I could check out, and if you have any ideas how to get out of the book bubble that I am in, let me know. Then I'll see you whenever. Don't forget to subscribe for random videos at random times. See you then.